August 22, 1944. Saipan Island, Mariana Islands. The morning sun beat down on a convoy of olive-drab trucks, winding their way along a dusty road carved into the war-torn landscape. Inside one of those trucks, 32 Japanese women sat in rigid silence, certain they were being transported to their execution. They had no way of knowing that what awaited them would shatter every belief they held about their captors and themselves. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the untold story of how propaganda crumbled in the face of reality, and how a battalion of African-American engineers would inadvertently wage the most effective psychological warfare campaign of the Pacific Theater. Lieutenant Akiko Tanaka clutched the small fabric bundle in her lap, her knuckles white with tension. At 26, she was the youngest nursing officer from the Imperial Japanese Navy Hospital who had survived the Battle of Saipan. The bundle contained everything she had managed to salvage: a photograph of her family in Yokohama, a small journal, and a silver hairpin that had belonged to her grandmother. Her military-issued nurse's uniform was stained with soil, sweat, and dried blood, none of it her own. "They're taking us to the cliffs," whispered Nurse Fumiko Hayashi, 43, sitting beside her. Just like the civilians. Her eyes darted to the American MP escort, riding in the back of the truck with them. "No," countered Captain Reiko Watanabe, the senior surviving medical officer. At 52, Captain Watanabe had served in Manchuria before being posted to Saipan. "If they wanted us dead, they would have shot us in the caves when they found us 3 days ago." The women had been hiding for weeks since the fall of Saipan on July 9th. American forces had captured the island after one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific Campaign, with over 3 Zulu American and 30 Yuzora Japanese deaths, including many civilians who had leapt from the island's northern cliffs rather than surrender. "Remember your training," Captain Watanabe continued, her voice barely audible over the truck's engine. "Name, rank, and number only. Reveal nothing of military value." Lieutenant Tanaka nodded mechanically, but her mind was racing with the horrifying stories she had heard about American captors. The Imperial Japanese military had been explicit in their descriptions. Americans were savage beasts who tortured prisoners, extracted information through unimaginable means, and took particular pleasure in violating women prisoners before killing them. The military training manuals had been specific about what to expect from the Americans, especially their Negro soldiers, described as barely human savages who were kept in chains until released upon Japanese prisoners. The truck jolted to a stop, sending a wave of terror through the women. The MP stood and gestured for them to exit. "Out, everyone out," he said, motioning with his rifle. One by one, the women climbed down. Lieutenant Tanaka was hit by the heavy scent of the ocean mixed with diesel fuel and the acrid smell of construction. They stood in what appeared to be a partially completed camp, with several finished wooden buildings and many more under construction. Men in olive-drab uniforms swarmed over half-built structures, operating machinery and hauling materials. "What is this place?" Lieutenant Tanaka whispered to Captain Watanabe. Before the captain could answer, a tall white officer approached, flanked by 2 other Americans. One carried a clipboard. The other was something Tanaka had never seen in person before: an African-American soldier, his dark skin glistening with sweat under the tropical sun. "I am Major Robert Hendricks, United States Army," the white officer announced through a Japanese-American interpreter who had accompanied them. "You are now at Internment Camp Susupe, Sector 3. This will be your home for the duration of the war." Lieutenant Tanaka translated his words mentally, struggling to reconcile them with what she had been taught to expect. Internment, not execution. "You are being classified as protected personnel under the Geneva Convention due to your medical status," Major Hendricks continued. "You will be housed separately from civilian internees and military POWs." The interpreter translated, but many of the women looked confused. The concept of protected status for captured medical personnel was foreign to their training. "The 96th Engineer Battalion is currently constructing your living quarters," Hendricks gestured toward the African-American soldiers working on the buildings. "Until completion, You will be temporarily housed in these finished structures. You will be provided with food, clean water, medical attention, and hygiene facilities. Captain Watanabe stepped forward. Captain Reiko Watanabe, Imperial Japanese Navy Medical Corps, she said stiffly in accented English. These women are under my command. I request to know your intentions regarding our treatment. Major Hendricks nodded. Your rank is acknowledged, Captain. As medical personnel, you and your nurses will be treated according to international law. You are not classified as combatants. Once processed, some of you may be asked to assist in treating civilian Japanese internees, of which we have over 13 Aozeran in need of medical attention. The mention of treating their own civilians caught Captain Watanabe off guard. Our people, they are alive. Yes, unlike the propaganda you may have heard, we do not massacre civilians. The Major's voice had an edge to it. Now, please follow Sergeant Williams. He will escort you to temporary quarters where you can clean up. You'll be issued new clothing, personal hygiene items, and receive medical examinations. The African-American soldier with the clipboard stepped forward. This way, ladies, he said through the interpreter, his voice surprisingly gentle. As they followed Sergeant Williams, Lieutenant Tanaka couldn't help but stare. She had never been so close to a black person before. Imperial propaganda had described them as animalistic, with exaggerated features and savage behavior. Yet Sergeant Williams moved with military precision, his uniform crisp despite the heat, his bearing professional. The temporary quarters were simple but clean, a long wooden building with cots, footlockers, and a washing area with privacy screens at one end. For women who had been hiding in caves and jungle for weeks, it seemed almost luxurious. Meal delivery in 30 minutes, Sergeant Williams informed them through the interpreter. Medical staff will come after that. The latrine is the small building 20 meters east. Any questions? The women remained silent, still processing their situation. Very well. He nodded to the MP who would stand guard, then left. Once the door closed, the women erupted in whispered conversations. This must be a trick, said Nurse Hayashi. They want to gain our trust before interrogation. Did you see how many Negro soldiers there are? Another nurse whispered. They're building the camp themselves. I counted at least 100. They're called the 96th Engineers, said Lieutenant Tanaka, remembering the Major's words. They seem organized. Captain Watanabe moved among them, restoring order. Regardless of appearances, remember your duty. We reveal nothing beyond what is required. We observe everything. If the Americans truly intend to treat civilians, we may gather valuable intelligence. Lieutenant Tanaka nodded, but found herself drawn to the small window. Outside, the 96th Engineer Battalion worked methodically, transforming raw materials into buildings at an impressive pace. She had been taught that Americans were inefficient and lazy, their equipment substandard. Yet what she witnessed contradicted everything in her training. One soldier in particular caught her attention, a muscular man directing the operation of a bulldozer with hand signals. He moved with confidence, guiding the massive machine with precision as it leveled ground for another structure. Lieutenant, come away from there, Captain Watanabe ordered. Do not let them see you watching. Tanaka obeyed, but her mind was already filling with questions. 30 minutes later, as promised, food arrived, delivered by 2 African-American soldiers under the supervision of a white corporal. The portions were generous. Rice, some kind of stew with vegetables and small pieces of meat, bread and canned fruit. The women hesitated, eyeing the food suspiciously. It's not poisoned, said the corporal through the interpreter, seeming to understand their reluctance. It's the same food our men eat. To prove his point, he took a spoonful from one of the trays and ate it. After he left, the women cautiously began to eat. For Lieutenant Tanaka, it was the first full meal she'd had in weeks. Despite her suspicion, she couldn't deny the food was well prepared and nourishing. Over the next 3 days, a routine developed. The women were gradually issued clean clothing, not uniforms but simple cotton dresses and undergarments, along with soap, towels, and other necessities. Medical examinations revealed most suffered from malnutrition and minor infections, but nothing severe. They were given vitamins and medication as needed. Throughout this time, Lieutenant Tanaka continued watching the 96th Engineers through whatever windows were available. Their efficiency fascinated her. The unit operated complex machinery, including bulldozers, graders, and power saws. They had erected 6 buildings in just 3 days, complete with plumbing and electrical wiring. On the 4th day, Major Hendricks returned with Captain Bernard Maxwell, the commanding officer of the 96th Engineer Battalion. "Ladies," Major Hendricks addressed them through the interpreter, "your permanent quarters are ready. Additionally, we're prepared to discuss your potential role in assisting with civilian medical needs." As the women gathered their few possessions, Lieutenant Tanaka noticed Captain Maxwell studying them. Unlike many of the white officers she had observed, who seemed to look through the Japanese women as if they were objects, Captain Maxwell's gaze was evaluative but respectful. "Captain Maxwell's men have constructed a special section of the camp for you," Hendricks explained as they walked. "It includes living quarters, a mess hall, recreation area, and most importantly, a small medical facility where some of you will work if you choose to assist with civilian care." "We have no choice but to assist," Captain Watanabe replied formally. "It is our duty under military law." Maxwell spoke for the first time. "With respect, Captain, under the Geneva Convention, you cannot be compelled to work. Your assistance would be voluntary, though compensated with improved rations and privileges." This concept, being given a choice, seemed to surprise Captain Watanabe as much as it did Lieutenant Tanaka. Their new quarters exceeded anything they could have imagined, a compound of 4 buildings surrounding a central courtyard. The barracks were simple but comfortable, with real beds instead of cots, footlockers for personal belongings, and large windows that allowed for circulation in the tropical heat. The mess hall was equipped with modern appliances, and the medical facility, though small, contained equipment that Lieutenant Tanaka recognized as equal to what they'd had in their own field hospital. "The medical facility will primarily serve your group's needs," Major Hendricks explained, "but it can also be used to treat civilian women and children if you agree to assist. Male military doctors will handle the civilian men and any serious cases." As they toured the compound, Lieutenant Tanaka noticed a tall African-American soldier supervising the installation of a water tank. It was the same man she had watched directing the bulldozer. Up close, she could see he was older than most soldiers, perhaps in his mid-30s, with a thoughtful expression that contradicted everything she had been taught about black Americans. "Who is that soldier?" she asked the interpreter, surprising herself with her boldness. The interpreter relayed her question to Captain Maxwell. "That's Technical Sergeant Isaiah Washington," Maxwell replied, "my best non-commissioned officer. Before the war, he was a civil engineer in Chicago. Built bridges, water systems, office buildings. Now he builds POW camps." There was a note of irony in Maxwell's voice that the interpreter didn't quite capture. Lieutenant Tanaka nodded, filing the information away. A Negro engineer. The concept contradicted everything in imperial education, which portrayed black Americans as primitive laborers at best, subhuman at worst. That evening, after their first meal in the new mess hall, Captain Watanabe called a meeting. "We must decide how to proceed," she told the nurses. "The Americans have requested our assistance with civilian medical care. While we are obligated to help our own people, we must consider the implications." "It could be a propaganda trap," suggested Major Yumiko Ito, the second highest ranking officer. "They will photograph us helping civilians to show how humane they are." "They genuinely need medical assistance for civilians," countered Lieutenant Tanaka. "There are only 32 of us, and reportedly over 13 Zuo-Zeron civilian internees." "Lieutenant Tanaka, you seem increasingly sympathetic to the Americans," Captain Watanabe observed sharply. Tanaka felt her face flush. "I am merely analyzing our situation objectively, Captain. The Americans have significant resources. If they only wanted propaganda images, they wouldn't have built an entire medical facility." After heated debate, Captain Watanabe made her decision. 10 of us will volunteer to assess the civilian situation. The rest will remain here. We will rotate personnel if the need is genuine. She looked directly at Lieutenant Tanaka. "You will be among the first group, Lieutenant. Your English skills may prove useful, and your objective analysis should be put to good use." The next morning, the 10 selected medical officers and nurses were escorted to the civilian sector of Camp Susupe. Lieutenant Tanaka was unprepared for what she saw. Thousands of Japanese civilians, women, children, elderly, occupied a vast compound of hastily constructed shelters. Many showed signs of malnourishment and trauma. Despite American efforts to provide for them, the sheer numbers made it a daunting task. The American doctor in charge, Captain Robert Stevens, greeted them with unexpected deference. "We're grateful for your assistance," he said through the interpreter. "Our medics are overwhelmed, and the cultural and language barriers make treatment difficult. We've set up a ward for women and children that desperately needs your expertise." The ward was a long tent with about 50 patients, mostly children suffering from malnutrition, respiratory infections, and wounds that had been inadequately treated during the fighting. Lieutenant Tanaka immediately recognized conditions she had treated in the Imperial Hospital. "We need supplies," she told Captain Stevens through the interpreter, automatically falling into her professional role. "Antibiotics for the infections, proper nutritional supplements for the children, and better sanitation." To her surprise, Stevens didn't dismiss her requests. "Make a list. I'll see what I can requisition. We're limited by what's available on the island, but a supply ship is due next week." For the next 8 hours, Lieutenant Tanaka worked alongside American nurses, treating Japanese civilians. The Americans deferred to her medical judgment, implemented her suggestions, and treated her as a professional equal. It was so contrary to what she had been taught that she kept waiting for the facade to drop. During a brief break, she stepped outside for fresh air and saw Technical Sergeant Washington supervising a team installing a water purification system for the civilian sector. "Your people need clean water," he said simply when he noticed her watching. "Dysentery's killing more of them than bullets did." His matter-of-fact statement, translated by a passing interpreter, startled her. There was no gloating over defeated enemies, just a practical assessment of a problem that needed solving. "You build water systems?" she asked hesitantly. "Among other things, designed municipal water systems for 3 counties back home." He wiped sweat from his brow. "Never thought I'd be building them on a Japanese island." Lieutenant Tanaka struggled to reconcile this man with imperial propaganda. "You were an engineer? Before the war?" "Civil engineer, yes. Graduated from Howard University in '32. Not that it mattered much to most folks." His laugh held no humor. "Designed buildings I couldn't enter because of my color. Now I'm building facilities for people who think I'm subhuman. War makes for strange situations, Mom." Before she could respond, an American nurse called her back to duty. As she returned to the ward, Lieutenant Tanaka's mind was spinning. Everything she witnessed contradicted her training. The Americans were treating Japanese civilians with humanity. African-American soldiers weren't savage beasts, but skilled professionals. The enemy was nothing like what imperial propaganda had described. That night, after returning to their compound, Lieutenant Tanaka made her report to Captain Watanabe and the other nurses. "The civilian situation is dire but improving under American care," she concluded. "They are genuinely trying to provide adequate food, shelter, and medical attention. Our assistance would significantly benefit our own people." "And the Negro soldiers?" Major Ito asked pointedly. "Have you observed their behavior around civilians?" Lieutenant Tanaka hesitated, aware of the dangerous territory. "They are primarily engaged in construction and engineering projects. They interact minimally with civilians and behave with military discipline." Captain Watanabe studied her carefully. "You've had direct interactions with them?" "Only in a professional capacity," Tanaka replied carefully. "Technical Sergeant Washington is overseeing water purification installation for the civilian sector." "The Negro who was previously an engineer," Captain Watanabe said, revealing she had overheard Tanaka's earlier conversation with Maxwell. "You find this credible?" "I have no reason to doubt it, Captain. The evidence of his technical expertise is apparent in the construction." Captain Watanabe's expression remained neutral, but her eyes hardened. "Be cautious, Lieutenant. The Americans are skilled at psychological warfare. What appears as humanitarian concern may be elaborate deception." Yet over the next 2 weeks, as more of the Japanese nurses rotated through civilian medical duty, they all reported similar observations. The Americans were providing genuine care to Japanese civilians. The 96th Engineers were transforming Camp Susupe from a primitive internment facility into a functional community with proper sanitation, typhoon-resistant housing, and medical infrastructure. For Lieutenant Tanaka, each day brought new contradictions to her imperial education. She watched Negro soldiers teaching Japanese children to play baseball in their off-duty hours. She observed them sharing extra rations with elderly civilians. Most disturbingly to her worldview, she saw them deferring to their white officers not out of fear, but out of professional respect in a functioning military hierarchy. Technical Sergeant Washington became a particular puzzle. As supervisor for most infrastructure projects affecting the medical facilities, he interacted regularly with Lieutenant Tanaka. Their conversations, initially brief and professional, gradually expanded as her English improved. She learned he had a wife and 2 children in Chicago, that he had designed water treatment plants across the Midwest, and that before the war, he had been working on plans for expanded subway systems in American cities. "How did you become an engineer?" she asked one day as they discussed the placement of additional sinks in the civilian medical ward. "In Japan, such education is very selective." "In America too, especially for colored folks," he replied, using the blueprint as a pretense to continue their conversation away from prying eyes. "My father was a porter on the railways, saved every penny so I could go to college. I studied twice as hard as the white students because I had to be twice as good to be considered half as qualified." "But you succeeded." "On paper, then came the real world." His pencil traced water lines on the blueprint. "Designed a municipal building in Indiana that won an anonymous competition. When they found out I was colored, suddenly the design had structural problems, and they awarded it to the second-place white architect. Lieutenant Tanaka considered this. Yet you still joined the American military?" "This uniform got me more respect than my engineering degree ever did, ironic as that is." He looked up from the blueprint. "And despite everything, it's still my country. I'm fighting for what it could be, not what it is." As he spoke, Lieutenant Tanaka was struck by an uncomfortable parallel. She had joined the Imperial Nursing Corps out of patriotic duty, believing Japan was creating a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere that would liberate Asian peoples from Western colonialism. The dissonance between that vision and the reality of Japanese imperial control was something she had pushed aside, just as Technical Sergeant Washington seemed to compartmentalize his complicated relationship with American society. "Your country treats you unfairly, yet you serve it loyally," she observed. "While working to change it," he corrected. "That's the difference between being loyal to your country and being blind to its flaws." The conversation was interrupted by an MP announcing that Captain Watanabe was looking for Lieutenant Tanaka. That evening, Captain Watanabe confronted her. "Your interactions with the Negro sergeant exceed professional necessity," she said without preamble. "This has been noticed." "We discussed technical matters related to medical facility improvements," Lieutenant Tanaka replied, maintaining her composure. "You discuss philosophy and politics," Captain Watanabe countered. "Nurse Hayashi overheard you today. This is dangerous territory, Lieutenant. The Americans are using him to extract information and undermine your loyalty." "With respect, Captain, our conversations contain nothing of military value, and his engineering expertise is genuine. The evidence surrounds us." Captain Watanabe's expression hardened. "You were selected for the Imperial Nursing Corps not only for your medical skills, but for your unwavering patriotism. I'm concerned that your objectivity has become compromised." "My loyalty to Japan remains absolute," Lieutenant Tanaka insisted. "But observing reality doesn't constitute disloyalty." "Reality?" Captain Watanabe's voice rose slightly. "You believe what the Americans show us is reality, this comfortable captivity, these well-behaved Negro soldiers. This is an elaborate deception." "To what end, Captain? If they wanted propaganda photos, they could have taken them weeks ago. If they wanted military information, they have thousands of actual combatant POWs to interrogate. The Americans play a long game, Captain Watanabe insisted. "They're systematically undermining our cultural beliefs to make us more compliant." Lieutenant Tanaka fell silent, recognizing she couldn't win this argument. But privately, a question had taken root in her mind. What if the deception wasn't American propaganda, but what she had been taught her entire life? The next day, as Lieutenant Tanaka assisted with vaccinations in the civilian sector, air raid sirens suddenly blared across the camp. Imperial Japanese aircraft were attacking Saipan, a desperate raid by planes based on distant islands that had somehow slipped through American air defenses. "Get everyone inside!" shouted Captain Stevens. "Medical personnel in the central ward with critical patients." As Lieutenant Tanaka helped move patients, she saw the 96th Engineers rapidly transforming from construction workers to soldiers, manning anti-aircraft positions and helping civilians to shelter. Technical Sergeant Washington was directing the evacuation of a construction site when the first bombs fell. One struck near the civilian sector, sending shrapnel flying. Without thinking, Lieutenant Tanaka ran toward the impact site, where several civilians lay injured. As she knelt beside an elderly man with a shrapnel wound, she was dimly aware of another plane approaching. "Get down!" Someone tackled her as an explosion rocked the ground nearby. When she recovered her senses, Technical Sergeant Washington was pulling her to her feet. "Medical bunkers that way," he said urgently. "Go!" "There are wounded here," she protested, pointing to the elderly man. Washington assessed the situation quickly. "I'll bring him. You're not properly protected out here." Without waiting for her response, he lifted the wounded civilian and followed her toward the bunker. They had almost reached it when machine gun fire strafed the ground around them. Lieutenant Tanaka felt a sharp pain in her leg and stumbled. Washington somehow managed to support both her and the elderly man, the final few meters to safety. Inside the bunker, American medics immediately attended to the wounded. Lieutenant Tanaka found herself on a treatment table as a medic cut away the fabric around her calf. "Flesh wound," the medic announced. "Clean through, missed the major vessels." Through the haze of pain, Lieutenant Tanaka saw Technical Sergeant Washington handing off the elderly Japanese civilian to another medic. His left arm was bleeding heavily. "You're wounded," she said in English. "Just caught some shrapnel, you got the worst of it." He moved aside as the medic began cleaning her wound. "You protected me." The realization struck her through the pain. "Why?" Washington looked confused by the question. "You're a doctor helping our patients. Why wouldn't I?" The simplicity of his response cut through years of imperial indoctrination. In that moment, Lieutenant Tanaka confronted the magnitude of the lies she had been taught. This man, portrayed in propaganda as a savage barely above animal intelligence, had risked his life to save not only her but an elderly Japanese civilian. The cognitive dissonance was too great to ignore. As the raid continued outside, Lieutenant Tanaka's world was changing inside that bunker. The foundations of her beliefs were cracking, and through those cracks, a different reality was visible, one where Americans weren't demons, where African-American soldiers weren't savages, where the narrative of Japanese superiority collided with the undeniable evidence of American technological and logistical dominance. And most disturbing of all was the question that now haunted her. If the imperial authorities had lied so completely about this, what else had they lied about? The air raid lasted 27 minutes but altered Camp Susupe permanently. 4 Japanese aircraft had been shot down, 3 American soldiers killed, and 17 Japanese civilians lost their lives, with dozens more wounded. For Lieutenant Akiko Tanaka, however, the true casualty was certainty, the unquestioning belief in imperial superiority that had guided her life. 3 days after the raid, Lieutenant Tanaka sat on a bench outside the medical facility, her bandaged leg propped on a crate. She had been relieved of duties until her wound healed, giving her unwelcome time to think. Across the compound, Technical Sergeant Washington supervised a team reinforcing a bunker. His left arm was bandaged where shrapnel had struck him, but he continued working as if unaffected. "The Negro sergeant looks well," observed Captain Watanabe, appearing beside Lieutenant Tanaka without warning. "As do you." "Captain," Tanaka acknowledged, stiffening. Their last conversation had ended poorly, and she expected another reprimand. Instead, Captain Watanabe sat beside her. For a long moment, the older woman said nothing, simply watching the construction work. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, quieter, with the rigid military formality partially dissolved. "I was in Manchuria in 1937, she said. "Harbin. I was assistant director of nursing at the military hospital there." Lieutenant Tanaka remained silent, sensing this was leading somewhere significant. "I believed everything I was told," Watanabe continued, "about Japanese divine destiny, about liberating Asia from Western imperialism, about our superior culture and discipline." She paused. "Then I saw what our forces did in Harbin. Not the sanitized reports that reached Tokyo, but the reality. I treated civilians who had been—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "Captain, we are not what I believed us to be," Watanabe said finally, "nor are the Americans what I was taught." She nodded toward Technical Sergeant Washington. "During the raid, while you were in surgery, he organized the defense of the civilian sector. When a bomb struck the primary water line, he had a bypass installed within hours. The civilians would have had no clean water otherwise." Lieutenant Tanaka absorbed this unexpected confidence from her superior. "Why are you telling me this now, Captain?" "Because I have been where you are," Watanabe replied. "Caught between loyalty and truth. I chose loyalty and have regretted it for 7 years. She straightened. "The doctors tell me your wound is healing well. When you're cleared for duty, I'm assigning you as our liaison to the 96th Engineers for Medical Infrastructure. Your English is improving, and we need someone who can communicate technical requirements clearly." The implication was clear. Captain Watanabe was officially sanctioning Lieutenant Tanaka's continued interaction with Technical Sergeant Washington and his unit. "Won't this raise concerns among the other nurses?" Lieutenant Tanaka asked. "Let me worry about that," Captain Watanabe replied. "Reality doesn't change because we deny it, Lieutenant, and the reality is that we need what these men can build." 2 days later, Lieutenant Tanaka was cleared for light duty. Her first official act as liaison was to request a meeting with Captain Maxwell and Technical Sergeant Washington regarding improvements to the civilian hospital facilities. They met in what the Americans called the Project Office, a small building filled with blueprints, technical manuals, and scale models of various camp structures. Captain Maxwell began by inquiring about her injury. "Healing well, sir," she replied in her improving English. "Thank you for asking." "Sergeant Washington tells me you kept working during the raid, even after being wounded," Maxwell noted. "That kind of dedication is universal in good medical personnel, regardless of nationality." His casual acknowledgement of professional respect across enemy lines still surprised her. "We have similar dedication in our engineering personnel," she replied, nodding toward Washington. Captain Maxwell smiled slightly. "Indeed. Now, I understand you have requests regarding the civilian hospital." Lieutenant Tanaka unfolded a hand-drawn diagram. "The current layout creates bottlenecks during patient processing. If we rearrange the admission area and add a separate triage section, we could improve efficiency by approximately 30%. Washington studied her diagram with professional interest. "This makes sense. We could extend the east wall by 4 meters without compromising structural integrity." He made a quick calculation on a notepad. "We have sufficient materials from the last supply delivery. Time frame would be about 5 days with 1 construction team." "Make it 3 days with 2 teams, Captain Maxwell decided. "Lieutenant Tanaka is right. That bottleneck became dangerous during the air raid." Lieutenant Tanaka was struck again by how readily they accepted her professional assessment. In the imperial military hierarchy, a nurse's suggestions about facility design would rarely reach command level, let alone be implemented. "One more thing," she added, emboldened by their receptiveness. "The recovery ward needs better ventilation. The afternoon heat makes it difficult for patients with respiratory conditions." "That's trickier," Washington acknowledged. "We're limited on electrical capacity for additional fans." "What about passive cooling?" Lieutenant Tanaka suggested. "In Okinawa, where I trained, hospitals used elevated floors and specific window placements to create natural air circulation." Washington looked at her with new interest. "Like a modified Mashrabia system, we could adapt that." He began sketching rapidly. Cross-ventilation here and here with elevated flooring. Captain, this could work not just for the hospital but for all the civilian barracks. Develop a prototype for the hospital ward, Maxwell ordered. If it works, we'll implement it more broadly. He turned to Lieutenant Tanaka. Thank you, Lieutenant. Your practical knowledge is valuable. As they left the meeting, Technical Sergeant Washington walked alongside Lieutenant Tanaka. You know architecture as well as medicine. Only traditional building techniques, she replied. My father was a carpenter before becoming a doctor. He believed in understanding practical matters alongside academic knowledge. A wise man, Washington nodded. Engineering principles work the same everywhere, regardless of politics. He hesitated, then added, I'm glad you're recovering well, Lieutenant. When I saw you hit during the raid. He didn't finish the sentence. Thank you for your assistance that day, she said formally, uncomfortably aware that their interaction had shifted from purely professional to something more personal. Just doing my job, he replied, equally formal. For the next 3 weeks, Lieutenant Tanaka worked closely with the 96th engineers. The ventilation system proved highly effective, reducing temperatures in the recovery ward by nearly 7 degrees. As Washington had suggested, the design was adapted for civilian barracks, significantly improving living conditions throughout the camp. During this period, Lieutenant Tanaka's understanding of American capabilities deepened. The 96th engineers didn't simply build basic structures, they created comprehensive infrastructure systems. Their supply chain management was extraordinary, with materials carefully inventoried, allocated and replenished through an efficient requisition system. Most impressive was their heavy equipment, bulldozers, graders, power shovels, and cement mixers, all operated by the African-American soldiers with remarkable skill. By comparison, she recalled Japanese military construction on Saipan before the American invasion, mostly hand labor with limited machinery, constantly delayed by supply shortages and bureaucratic inefficiency. The contrast was stark and troubling. One afternoon, as Lieutenant Tanaka observed a water filtration system installation, she noticed Technical Sergeant Washington teaching a young Japanese civilian the basics of plumbing. The boy, perhaps 14, watched with rapt attention as Washington demonstrated how to join pipes with proper seals. You're teaching him a trade, she observed when the boy returned to his assigned area. Kid has an aptitude for it, Washington replied. Figured out the pressure testing sequence just by watching us yesterday. In Japan, he would be training for military service, Lieutenant Tanaka said quietly. Here, he's learning to build instead of destroy. Washington tightened a valve with a wrench. Seems like a better future to me. If Japan loses the war, she said, testing his reaction. Washington looked at her directly. Lieutenant, Japan has already lost the war. The only question is how many more people die before your leaders accept it. His bluntness was shocking, but what disturbed her more was her inability to dispute his assessment. The evidence surrounded her, the scale of American production, the advanced technology, the seemingly limitless resources. More Japanese civilians survived daily in American captivity than remained alive on Japanese-held islands under constant bombardment and naval blockade. We will fight to the last person, she said, repeating the official position. I know, Washington replied, his expression somber. That's the tragedy. Your people's courage isn't in question. But courage doesn't outproduce factories. He pointed to the water filtration system. This unit is one of 17 we're installing across the camp. Each one processes 10,000 gallons daily. Back home, we're manufacturing thousands of these monthly, along with tanks, planes, ships, while your civilians starve. His words hung in the air between them, not spoken with arrogance but as a simple statement of fact. Before she could respond, an MP approached. Lieutenant Tanaka, Major Hendricks requests your presence at headquarters. At headquarters, Lieutenant Tanaka found not only Major Hendricks, but also Captain Watanabe and a Japanese-American soldier she hadn't seen before. Lieutenant, this is Sergeant David Nakamura from Intelligence. Major Hendricks introduced the Japanese-American. We have a situation in the civilian sector that requires your assistance, Sergeant Nakamura explained in fluent Japanese. We've discovered a group of Imperial Army officers hiding among the civilians. They've been organizing resistance, spreading propaganda that Americans execute POWs, and preventing civilians from accepting medical treatment. Last night, they murdered a civilian they suspected of cooperating with us. We need medical personnel the civilians trust to counter the misinformation, Major Hendricks continued through Nakamura's translation. Captain Watanabe has suggested you lead a team of nurses to conduct direct outreach. Lieutenant Tanaka looked to Captain Watanabe, who nodded. The situation is critical, Lieutenant. Civilians are refusing vaccinations because they've been told the injections contain poison. Children are dying needlessly. The mission began the following morning. Lieutenant Tanaka and 5 nurses, accompanied by Sergeant Nakamura and an MP escort, entered the civilian sector with medicines and educational materials. Their reception was decidedly cool. Women pulled children away, men turned their backs, and elderly people stared with undisguised suspicion. They fear we've been corrupted by the Americans, Nurse Hayashi whispered. Or worse, that we're Korean or Formosan collaborators in Japanese disguise, added another nurse. Lieutenant Tanaka approached an elderly woman sitting outside a barracks. Good morning, grandmother. I am Lieutenant Akiko Tanaka, Imperial Japanese Navy Medical Corps. May I speak with you? The woman regarded her suspiciously. If you're truly Japanese military, why do you work with the American barbarians? I am a doctor first. My duty is to preserve Japanese lives, Lieutenant Tanaka replied, kneeling despite her healing leg wound to be at eye level with the woman. The Americans have asked us to explain their medical program because many civilians fear treatment. With good reason, the woman retorted. Everyone knows Americans experiment on prisoners. The soldiers hiding among us have explained everything. What soldiers? Lieutenant Tanaka asked carefully. The woman's eyes narrowed. I've said too much already. Grandmother, I was captured during the battle for Saipan. I served at the Imperial Navy Hospital until its destruction. I have been in American custody for 5 weeks. Lieutenant Tanaka held the woman's gaze. In that time I have seen no experiments, no executions, no mistreatment of prisoners. I have seen only medical care offered equally to all. Pretty lies, the woman muttered, but with less conviction. Look at my leg, Lieutenant Tanaka said, revealing her bandaged calf. I was wounded during the air raid 3 weeks ago. American doctors treated me. If they wished us harm, why would they waste medicine on enemy personnel? The elderly woman had no answer for this. The men hiding among you, Lieutenant Tanaka continued gently, are endangering your grandchildren by spreading these stories. Children are dying from preventable diseases because they are denied vaccination. A small crowd had gathered as they spoke. From their expressions, Lieutenant Tanaka could see her words were having some effect. She stood and addressed them directly. I am Lieutenant Akiko Tanaka, Imperial Japanese Navy Medical Corps, identification number 77239444. I was captured honorably in battle. I have not been tortured, assaulted, or mistreated. I continue to serve Japan by ensuring our civilians receive proper medical care. A murmur ran through the crowd. A middle-aged man stepped forward. My son has fever. The American doctors want to give him injections, but we were told it would sterilize him. It's typhoid vaccine, Lieutenant Tanaka explained. Without it, he could die. The same vaccine is given to American soldiers. How do we know this is true? Challenged a younger man at the back of the crowd. Something in his bearing suggested military training, possibly one of the hidden soldiers Sergeant Nakamura had mentioned. Because I will administer the vaccine myself, Lieutenant Tanaka replied, and I will explain each medication in Japanese before administering it. Over the next 4 hours, Lieutenant Tanaka and her nurses examined over 60 patients, administered vaccines, and distributed medicine. With each successful treatment, more civilians came forward, their fear gradually replaced by cautious trust. As they prepared to leave, the elderly woman from earlier approached Lieutenant Tanaka. There are others who need help, she said quietly. In the back barracks, the soldiers won't let the Americans near them. Lieutenant Tanaka glanced at Sergeant Nakamura, who had overheard. He nodded almost imperceptibly. We'll return tomorrow with more supplies, Lieutenant Tanaka promised. Spread the word that Japanese medical personnel will provide treatment." On the walk back to their compound, Sergeant Nakamura fell in beside her. "You did well, Lieutenant. The intelligence will help us locate the officers." "I didn't do it for intelligence purposes," she replied sharply. "Those are my people suffering from preventable diseases." "Of course," Nakamura said, unperturbed by her tone, "but the result serves both purposes. Those officers are endangering civilians by preventing medical care and spreading misinformation. They need to be removed and properly detained as military POWs." Lieutenant Tanaka couldn't argue with his logic, even as she felt uncomfortable with her inadvertent role in exposing the hidden soldiers. "What will happen to them?" "Standard POW processing," Nakamura assured her. "Despite what they've been telling the civilians, we don't execute prisoners." That night, Lieutenant Tanaka couldn't sleep. She paced their compound, her mind churning with conflicting emotions. She had taken an oath as a medical officer to preserve life. She had also sworn loyalty to the Emperor and the Imperial military. Today, those commitments had come into direct conflict. She found Captain Watanabe sitting alone near the edge of the compound, smoking a cigarette, a luxury provided by the Americans that the captain had initially refused, but now apparently accepted. Unable to sleep, "Lieutenant," Watanabe asked, offering her a cigarette. Lieutenant Tanaka took it, though she rarely smoked. "I feel I've betrayed my oath today," she admitted. "Which one?" Captain Watanabe asked pointedly. "To medicine or to the Empire?" "Both. Neither." Lieutenant Tanaka struggled to articulate her conflict. "By helping the Americans identify hiding soldiers, I betrayed my military oath. By allowing those soldiers to endanger civilians with misinformation, I would betray my medical oath." Captain Watanabe nodded, exhaling smoke. "The fundamental problem, Lieutenant, is that we were taught these oaths could never conflict. Imperial doctrine presented military necessity and civilian welfare as inseparable. Reality has proven otherwise." They smoked in silence for a moment before Captain Watanabe continued. What would have happened to those civilians in Imperial-controlled territory if they had refused military directives regarding medicine? Lieutenant Tanaka knew the answer. They would be punished, possibly executed as traitors. Yet here, under American control, what happens to civilians who refuse treatment? Nothing. The Americans try again to persuade them. "And there lies the contradiction that is destroying our certainty," Captain Watanabe said softly. "Our enemy treats our civilians with greater humanity than our own military would." She crushed out her cigarette. "Get some sleep, Lieutenant. Tomorrow will be difficult." The next day's mission to the civilian sector was more organized. Lieutenant Tanaka led a team of 8 nurses, accompanied by Japanese-speaking American medics carrying additional supplies. Word had spread, and dozens of civilians awaited their arrival. As they set up a temporary clinic, Lieutenant Tanaka noticed increased MP presence around the perimeter. Clearly, an operation to detain the hiding soldiers was being prepared. She focused on her medical duties, trying to ignore the knowledge of what would soon occur. By midday, they had treated nearly 100 patients. The elderly woman from the previous day approached again, this time bringing a small girl. "My great-granddaughter," she explained. "She has been sick for days. The soldiers said to let her fight it naturally, that Japanese children are stronger than American medicine." Lieutenant Tanaka examined the child and recognized the symptoms immediately: advanced diphtheria. "She needs antibiotic treatment immediately, and possibly intubation if her airway becomes compromised." As they prepared the injection, a commotion erupted across the compound. MPs were entering barracks, evacuating civilians, and searching for the hidden soldiers. The operation had begun. "Keep working," instructed Sergeant Nakamura, who had materialized beside them. "We'll handle this." Lieutenant Tanaka administered the antibiotics to the little girl, trying to focus solely on her patient despite the shouts and commotion. Suddenly, a man burst through the clinic entrance, brandishing a makeshift knife. He wore civilian clothes, but his military bearing was unmistakable. "Traitors!" he screamed, lunging toward Lieutenant Tanaka. "Collaborators with the American devils!" Before he could reach her, Sergeant Nakamura tackled him from the side. They struggled briefly before MPs rushed in and subdued the attacker. "Are you all right, Lieutenant?" Nakamura asked, wiping blood from a cut on his cheek. Lieutenant Tanaka nodded, her heart racing. Yes. Thank you. The operation continued throughout the afternoon. In total, 17 Imperial Army officers were found hiding among the civilians. Each had been spreading propaganda and preventing civilians from cooperating with American authorities. Once they were removed, the atmosphere in the civilian sector visibly relaxed. As they packed their medical supplies, the great-grandmother approached again. "Mayuki is breathing easier already," she said, indicating the little girl who now slept peacefully. "The soldiers told us American medicine was poison. Why would they lie to us?" Lieutenant Tanaka chose her words carefully. "They believed they were protecting you. They were taught, as we all were, that Americans are monsters who cannot be trusted. And yet, here you are, working with these monsters to save Japanese lives," the old woman observed shrewdly. "I am beginning to believe that the true monsters are not defined by nationality," Lieutenant Tanaka replied quietly. That evening, Major Hendricks called a meeting with all Japanese medical personnel. "First, I want to thank you for your assistance today," he began through Sergeant Nakamura's translation. "Your actions saved lives and improved conditions for everyone in the camp." He then explained that with the hidden officers removed, the civilian sector would be reorganized to improve living conditions. The 96th Engineers would construct improved housing, water systems, and recreational facilities. Japanese medical personnel would be formally integrated into the camp's healthcare system, with increased responsibility and corresponding privileges. "This is not about forced collaboration," Major Hendricks emphasized. "It's about practical necessity. We lack sufficient medical personnel with appropriate language and cultural knowledge. You possess those skills. The civilians need your help." Captain Watanabe, speaking for the group, accepted the arrangement with formal military courtesy. As they left the meeting, Lieutenant Tanaka found Technical Sergeant Washington waiting outside. "Heard about the excitement today," he said, falling into step beside her. "That took courage." "It was necessity, not courage, Ma," she replied. "The children needed treatment." "Still," Washington persisted, "standing up to your own military, knowing they'd see you as a traitor, that's not easy." Lieutenant Tanaka stopped walking. "Is that how you see us? As traitors to Japan?" Washington considered the question carefully. "I see you as doctors putting patients above politics. That's not treason, it's integrity." His answer resonated uncomfortably with her own thoughts. "The world is not as simple as I was taught," she admitted. "It never is." Washington smiled slightly. "Come see something we just finished." He led her to the edge of the compound where a new building stood completed, the expanded civilian hospital they had designed together. It featured the passive cooling system she had suggested, integrated with American electrical and plumbing systems. Japanese and American design principles had been merged to create something more effective than either could have achieved alone. "It works better than our projections," Washington said with professional pride. "Temperature differential is nearly 10 degrees, and the air circulation rate exceeds specifications by 30%. Lieutenant Tanaka walked through the empty ward, admiring the implementation of their collaborative design. "It's come beautiful," she said, surprising herself with the word choice. "Functional, efficient, and harmonious." "That's what happens when different perspectives work together instead of against each other," Washington observed. The symbolism wasn't lost on Lieutenant Tanaka. This building represented what could be achieved through cooperation rather than conflict, a physical manifestation of a different possible relationship between their nations. Over the next 3 months, Lieutenant Tanaka's role expanded. She became the primary liaison between Japanese medical personnel and the American administration, coordinating healthcare throughout the camp. Under her guidance, mortality rates among civilians dropped dramatically, particularly among children and the elderly. The 96th Engineers continued transforming Camp Susupe from a basic internment facility into a functioning community. They built schools, communal kitchens, improved barracks, and recreational facilities. Technical Sergeant Washington implemented a training program where Japanese civilians with technical aptitude learned construction and engineering skills, working alongside American soldiers to build their own community infrastructure. Lieutenant Tanaka often found herself working directly with Washington, their professional relationship deepening into mutual respect and something approaching friendship, a concept that would have been unthinkable to her before captivity. One evening in November 1944, as they reviewed plans for a new water distribution system, Washington shared news that had just reached the island. "Philippines' invasion has begun," he said quietly. Leyte Gulf was the largest naval battle in history. Japanese Navy suffered heavy losses. Lieutenant Tanaka absorbed this information silently. She had long since stopped believing imperial propaganda about inevitable victory, but each confirmation of Japan's deteriorating military position still pained her. "The war will reach the home island soon," she said, voicing what they both knew. Washington nodded grimly. "Unless your government surrenders." "They won't," she replied with certainty. "Not until—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "Not until destruction becomes unbearable." Washington completed her thought. "I know. That's what keeps me awake at night, knowing what's coming for your people." The genuine concern in his voice struck her. This man, whom she had been taught to view as a savage enemy, worried about the suffering of Japanese civilians he had never met. "Why do you care?" she asked abruptly. "After everything Japan has done?" Washington considered the question. "Because ending cycles of hatred requires someone to step outside them," he said finally. "I've experienced enough hatred in America to know it solves nothing. Yet you fight for America despite how it treats you," she observed. "I fight for what America could be," he corrected. "Just as you served what Japan could have been, not what it became." His insight into her own conflicted patriotism was startlingly accurate. Lieutenant Tanaka had joined the Imperial Nursing Corps, believing in Japan's proclaimed mission to liberate Asia from Western colonialism. The reality of imperial occupation, the brutality she had glimpsed in her assignments, had already created doubts before her capture. "What happens after the war?" she asked suddenly. "To people like me, Japanese who collaborated with Americans?" "You haven't collaborated," Washington replied firmly. "You've fulfilled your medical oath to care for your people under extraordinary circumstances. There's a difference." "Not everyone will see it that way," she said quietly. "No," he acknowledged. "But history will." In January 1945, as American forces prepared for the invasion of Iwo Jima, Major Hendricks called Lieutenant Tanaka to headquarters. Captain Maxwell and Technical Sergeant Washington were already there, along with Captain Watanabe. "Lieutenant, we have a proposition," Major Hendricks began. "As the war moves closer to Japan, more Japanese civilians will come under American control. We need medical personnel who understand both cultures to help manage the transition." He outlined a program where Lieutenant Tanaka and selected others would receive specialized training to serve as intermediaries between American occupation authorities and Japanese civilians after the war. The program would include advanced medical training at American facilities in Hawaii, cultural orientation, and administrative preparation. "This is entirely voluntary," Hendricks emphasized. "You would retain your current status under the Geneva Convention. This is not asking you to renounce Japan or your military oath." Lieutenant Tanaka looked at Captain Watanabe, whose face revealed nothing. "May I ask the captain's opinion?" "I have already accepted a similar position," Watanabe replied calmly. "Japan will need bridges to the future, Lieutenant. Those bridges will be built by people who understand both sides." The decision wasn't easy, but ultimately Lieutenant Tanaka accepted. By April 1945, as American forces captured Okinawa, she had completed initial training and was assisting in developing protocols for civilian medical care in occupied territories. Throughout this period, her professional partnership with Technical Sergeant Washington continued. Together, they designed systems that would eventually be implemented across the Pacific as American forces advanced. Their work saved countless lives, both American and Japanese, by creating infrastructure that prevented disease outbreaks among displaced populations. In late July 1945, as Lieutenant Tanaka reviewed vaccination protocols with Washington, he seemed unusually preoccupied. "Something's happening," he said finally. "Something big. The officers won't say what, but there's been unusual activity. Special couriers, secure communications, restricted areas." Lieutenant Tanaka had noticed the same signs. A new invasion plan? No, Washington shook his head. This is different. Whatever it is, the senior officers are both excited and almost afraid. 2 weeks later, on August 6th, they learned what had happened. An atomic bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima. 3 days later, another destroyed Nagasaki. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. The news hit the Japanese personnel at Camp Susupe like a physical blow. Many refused to believe it, insisting it was American propaganda. Others fell into deep despair. Captain Watanabe gathered them together and spoke with quiet dignity. "Our emperor has decided this course to preserve the Japanese people from extinction," she said. "It is our duty to honor his wisdom by continuing our work. Japan will need healing. We are uniquely positioned to help provide it." In the days that followed, Lieutenant Tanaka threw herself into preparations for the massive humanitarian effort that would be needed in post-war Japan. Technical Sergeant Washington and the 96th Engineers accelerated their training of Japanese civilians in construction techniques that would be crucial for rebuilding. "You'll be going home soon," Lieutenant Tanaka remarked to Washington as they completed plans for portable medical facilities. "Back to America, yes," he corrected. "Whether it's home, that remains to be seen. Colored soldiers coming back face challenges." "Will you return to engineering?" "If they'll let me," he replied, "though I expect I'll go back to designing buildings I'm not allowed to enter." He smiled ruefully. "What about you? Will Japan be the same home you left?" "No," she said simply. "Neither Japan nor I are what we were." On their final day, working together before Washington's unit was scheduled for redeployment, he handed her a set of blueprints. "These are the designs we created together," he explained. "The integrated cooling systems, water purification, modular hospital units, all of it. They're already being implemented in occupation planning, but I wanted you to have the original designs." Lieutenant Tanaka was touched by the gesture. "Thank you. These represent more than buildings. They represent what's possible when people see beyond what they've been taught about each other," Washington agreed. "Maybe that's the only victory that matters in the end." The next morning, Lieutenant Akiko Tanaka stood with Captain Watanabe and the other Japanese medical personnel as the 96th Engineer Battalion formed up for departure. As Technical Sergeant Washington passed in formation, he offered a formal salute, a gesture of professional respect between equals that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. Lieutenant Tanaka returned the salute with equal formality, conscious of the distance they had traveled from their first meeting, when she had feared him as a savage and he had seen her as an enemy. 2 weeks later, as Lieutenant Tanaka prepared for her new assignment in occupied Japan, she wrote in her journal, the same one she had clutched so desperately upon arrival at Camp Susupe. "When I was captured, I believed I understood the world and my place in it. I was a daughter of the Empire, superior by birth and culture to our enemies. The Americans were savage barbarians, their Negro soldiers the most primitive among them. Reality dismantled these certainties piece by piece. I watched men I had been taught to despise build infrastructure more advanced than anything in Japan. I saw compassion where I expected cruelty. I witnessed professional excellence where propaganda promised only primitive incompetence. The true devastation of war is not the buildings destroyed or even the lives lost, but the destruction of certainty, the comfortable illusions that allow us to divide humanity into us and them, civilized and savage, superior and inferior. I do not know what Japan will become in defeat. I do not know what I will become in a world where everything I was taught has proven false. But I carry with me the blueprints for buildings designed by an American Negro engineer and a Japanese naval officer working together. Perhaps they are also blueprints for a different kind of future." In the decades that followed, Dr. Akiko Tanaka would become a prominent figure in Japan's post-war medical establishment, pioneering public health initiatives that saved countless lives. The hospital designs she helped create with Technical Sergeant Isaiah Washington would influence medical facility construction throughout Asia. In 1964, when the Olympic Games came to Tokyo, symbolizing Japan's re-emergence on the world stage, Dr. Tanaka received a package from Chicago. It contained architectural plans for the newly constructed Northwestern Memorial Hospital. designed by Washington and Associates engineering firm. A note was enclosed. Dr. Tanaka, some wars end with surrender documents. Ours ended with blueprints. Perhaps that makes all the difference. Isaiah Washington. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.